What's up YouTube, Dal here from Zephyr, and today I am bringing you an update to vampires. That's right, I've decided to put this build together, and what I tried to do when I was putting this build together is I've tried to go for as pure as possible without relying on the zombie support, because I feel zombies kind of take away with what the vampires want to do, and that's all about taking control of your opponent's monsters and then using them as XYZ fodder. I've also decided to make this deck more predominantly go second than it is go first, just because I think it gives the deck the most capability of being able to utilize cards like Mind Control and of course Change of Heart to get to its overall end goal. So with all of that out of the way, please smash that like button, hit that notification bell and subscribe so you don't miss out on any more upcoming content. I'm going to take you through the profile, explain what we've got and then talk you through why we are choosing to play the way we are. So we're going to start off with the most recent vampire card we've got. Please Konami, can we get some more vampire support, because most of it unfortunately does seem a little bit dated. Now you will definitely be playing 3 of this guy. I only have 2 of them, so at the moment I'm proxying in a vampire sorcerer in the space of the 3rd vampire ghost. Now the vampire ghost, if it is normal summoned, and that's one big downside of most vampire cards, is that they are all on normal summon. You get to send a vampire card from your hand or face up on the field to the graveyard to add a level 4 or higher vampire monster from the deck to the hand. And if you do, you get to send a level 2 or lower vampire monster from the deck to the graveyard. During the main phase, you get a quick effect to banish this card from the graveyard and pay 500 life points. Immediately after this effect resolves, normal summon a vampire monster. You can only use this effect once per turn, or each effect once per turn. So, as the whole idea of the vampire lore goes, you are going to be utilizing familiars, which is basically like vampire pets, and they're the ones you're going to want to be sending to the graveyard. So we're going to be going with 2 retrainer and 2 familiar. Now both of these have very cool graveyard effects. You can play them at 3 if you want to, but the idea is because we want to utilize the vampire ghost at its max potential, that's really where you're going to be able to utilize the ability of floating these from the graveyard back to the board. So if this card is special summoned, you pay 500 life points to add a vampire spell or trap from the deck to the hand. And if this card is in the graveyard, you get to send a vampire card from your hand or face on the field to the graveyard to special summon it, but banishing it when it leaves the field. The same pretty much applies for the familiar. So if it is special summoned, you pay 500 life points to add a vampire monster from the deck to the hand. And if it is in the graveyard, you get to send a vampire card from your hand or face on the field to the graveyard to special summon it. Again, banish it when it leaves the field. Now the reason you can utilize both of these at 3 is because they do become very good at discard fodder, so that's definitely something you could consider. It really depends on your personal playstyle. I wanted to get Vampire Lord in here as well, but because I wanted to go as aggressive as possible with a go second option, I wasn't really focusing on the Vampire Lord's second effect, where it's when it does battle damage to declare a monster spell or trap and then get your opponent to Foolish Bury that card, because at the end of the day, you're probably going to give your opponent more advantage when you're allowing them to do that stuff, and unless you're going to be pushing into the game after using Vampire Lord, you're not really going to get to where you want to go. So, for the bigger vampires, we are playing the 1 vampire vamp. So once per turn, when this card, annoyingly, or a vampire monster is normal summoned to your side of the field, you get to target a face-up monster your opponent controls, whose attack is higher than this card, so above 2000, and you get to equip it to this card, which is really nice. This gains attack equal to the combined original attack of the monsters equipped to it by this effect. If this card is sent to the graveyard while equipped with a card by the effect, you special summon this card from the graveyard. So that's really nice, because once you steal one of your opponent's monsters and have it as an equipped spell, or technically an equipped monster, if you then use Vampire Vamp to link it off, you're then going to get the ability to float it back, which is really helpful, because probably one of your most important extra deck cards, just because it gives you what you need, and that is the ability to constantly keep stealing your opponent's monsters, is the Vampire Fascinator, which we'll talk about a little bit later on once we get to it. The other vampires we are playing is, of course, the Void. So this one, again, annoyingly, is on normal summon, but that's the whole idea behind the vampires, is that you want to be able to get your familiars on the board as special summoned and use them as tribute fodder in order to get to cards like the Void. So if this is normal summoned, you get to target up to 2 monsters in your opponent's graveyard and special summon those monsters to your field in defense. Again, the best thing about that is your 2 XYZ or main XYZs in the extra deck in the form of the Zombie Vampire and, of course, Sheridan. They both get the ability that if you're using a monster that your opponent is technically owns, you get to treat its level, that has a level specifically, you can treat it as a level 6 or an 8 to perform the XYZ summons. On top of that as well, their effects are negated. However, when a monster effect is activated while a monster or monsters with the same name is in the graveyards, so basically if they activate Ash Blossom White, either you or your opponent have them in the graveyard, you get to negate the activation. If a monster or monsters is special summoned from your opponent's graveyard, you get to tribute 2 monsters to special summon this card from your graveyard. Now, this is the biggest issue, is the fact that you technically want this first effect to be on special summon as well, because then it means that once you're playing cards like Vampire Vamp and you get to give your opponent or bring a card back from your opponent's graveyard to their field, you could trigger off your Void to then summon it back and then take 2 of your opponent's monsters. I feel that's an effect that, yes, would be incredibly busted, but even if it did say, okay, but you cannot summon more, you can't summon for the rest of the turn except vampires, I think it would be completely fine. And I quite like the idea of how vampires are supposed to infect others and then turn them into vampires themselves. It's a really kind of cool concept. I just don't feel there are enough cards in the game right now that allow the vampires to do that successfully. We've then got the 1 Vampire Froilan. Now you kind of need to utilize this in order to kind of get your attacks high enough while also being able to kind of push in for an OTK. So when a monster declares an attack, you get to special this card from the hand in defense. You can only use each of the following effects once per turn, and you can only use that effect once per turn as well. So once per battle, if you're a zombie monster, you can only use the previous effect once per turn. Once per battle, if your zombie monster battles an opponent's monster, during the damage calculation, you get a quick effect to pay a number of life points, maximum 3,000 in multiples of 100. Your battling monster gains that difference of attack and defense during damage calculation only. At the end of the battle phase, if this card destroys any monster by battle, you get to special summon it from the graveyard to your field. Now that's really kind of cool. But the issue is, again, Froilan is only 600 attack. So you're going to be paying huge amounts of life points in order to do that. Now, the only reason that is a mass benefit is if you were to play the Punk engine, you're already burning your own life points, but it does mean that if you get to utilize a card like Psychic End Punisher, you're going to be able to get the max attack boost out of it because you're getting a benefit of using your own life points. We've then got the 1 Shadow Vampire. Now, this is again is a little bit interesting alongside the XYZ version of this in the form of the Crimson Knight, purely for the fact that when they use their effects, only those monsters that they steal can attack. So it cannot be used for material for an XYZ summon except for the summon of a dark monster. When this card is normal summoned, you get to special summon a dark vampire monster from your hand or deck except itself. However, monsters you control cannot attack for the rest of the turn except that special summon monster. Now that's a big issue, again, when most of your strong vampire monsters want to be normal summoned in the form of the Void. When you're being able to utilize this effect to mainly get to the Scarlet Scourge, what you've got to remember is, yes, you're able to extend from that point on, but the only one that can attack is the one that you summon off of your Shadow Vampire. So again, it kind of restricts your type of playstyle, and you're only really going to want to utilize your Shadow Vampire during main phase 2, unless you're bringing out a card that is going to steal one of your opponent's monsters to utilize your XYZ plays from that point on. Speaking of the Scarlet Scourge, it's the only big one that we are playing at 2. And the reason for that one is, unlike the rest, on normal or special, you get to pay 1,000 life points to target a vampire monster in your graveyard except itself and special summon it. It cannot attack this turn. You can only use this effect once per turn, and at the end of the battle phase, if this card destroys any monster by battle, you get to special summon them from the graveyard to your field. Now that's really the effect that all vampire big boss monsters should have had, in my opinion, because that's basically what vampires do. This is probably the best one that we have, just because it has that ability to bring a vampire back from the graveyard. Unfortunately, it cannot attack, but you can use that as material. And then the fact that it gets to steal one of your opponent's monsters is how it can be very useful in order to get into your Vampire Sheridan, for the pure fact that your Scourge is already a level 6. You steal any one of your opponent's monsters, as long as it is not a Link monster, and as long as it has a level, you can then overlay both and go into the Vampire Sheridan. Moving on to the rest of the vampire spells, we are playing Triple Domain. Now, Vampire's Domain, again, has a very kind of cool effect. You, once per turn, pay 500 life points. During your main phase, this turn, you can normal summon one vampire monster in addition to your normal summoner set, even if this card leaves the field. Unfortunately, you can only gain that effect once per turn, and then each time your vampire monster battles, inflicts damage to your opponent, you gain the same amount of life points back. So again, it's very nice to kind of substitute the life points that you're constantly paying to use your effects and then trying to get them back in one way or another, so it can get a little bit grindy. The one thing I will give the vampires is all of the artworks are like absolutely amazing. Especially the next two cards. I think these are probably like the best looking vampire cards we've ever had. So Vampire Desire and then the Vampire Domination. Like the artwork on Domination is incredible. Like you've got the familiars all around the place. You've got Sheridan in the middle. It just looks so dark. And then when you put all three of these ones together, they look like they're part of like a connecting storyboard, which is really cool. So if you just cut those two out, this one probably doesn't have as much red in the background, but you could kind of see how you could see that as one big art piece. So you'd have the red moon in the middle, and then you've got the two on the other side, and I just think it looks absolutely incredible. Anyway, Vampire's Desire. Target one, you get to activate one of the following effects. Target one face-up monster your opponent controls, send a vampire monster from your deck to the graveyard with a different level from that monster, and if you do, the targeted monster becomes that level of that sent monster in the graveyard until the end of the turn. Target a vampire monster in your graveyard, send one monster you control to the graveyard, and if you do, special summon the targeted monster. Now the second effect, really nice. The first effect, why couldn't it be its own mind control? Why couldn't it target a face-up monster your opponent controls, send one from the deck to the graveyard, and then take control of that monster? How good would that have been to be able to send a familiar and then steal one of your opponent's monsters? It would just help the strategy out massively. The next card we're playing is 2 Zombie World. Now the reason we're playing Zombie World is because we are also playing Super Poly. This is like the only zombie-esque element that we are utilising in this deck, just because it's such a powerful board breaker. Now, admittedly with the extra deck, I'm not playing any other Super Poly targets apart from the Never Soul Dragon. Now, the reason for that is purely for the fact that the Necro Dragon actually helps you out get into your rank 8 plays. You could play stuff like Garura, which will help you get into your rank 6 plays, because annoyingly, they're generic. They don't need vampire cards. They don't even need to be like one vampire card and then one other card, which is kind of nice because then that's how you can utilize your opponent's cards, but you would have liked it a little bit more. Now, these are definitely interchangeable just to make them more consistent if you wanted to. Like I said, I tried to minimize the involvement of the zombies themselves, but it was so powerful with Zombie World and then Super Poly being able to kind of break any board once you get these two into play. There was kind of something that I felt you needed to kind of utilize. But again, these can become Triple Tactics Thrust if you've got them, which will help you get more into your board breaker cards, which I'll show you in a second. Or they can be utilized to go down the Punk version, which is a 6-card engine, or you can go into the Horus engine, which is like a 7-card engine. And the main use of the Horus engine is to get into your vampire, the zombie vampire, because you get to revive after you've milled from both decks, either from your graveyard or your opponent's graveyard. So again, it's another way of getting a hold of one of your opponent's monsters to utilize its effect. So for your board breakers, your board stealers, everything you want to try and take control of, because we're going more aggressive and going focused on going second more than first, you can play Crackdown if you want to go first, but I decided to go with Mind Control because, nicely, it isn't a hard once per turn, so you constantly keep stealing your opponent's monsters. Triple Tactics Talents, which is basically like a form of control if you wanted to, but it also gives you the ability to draw, look at your opponent's hand, everything you need to. And then, of course, Change of Heart, like the OG Stealer. You can play stuff like Brain Control if you wanted to as well, but you're already paying enough life points, and when you can utilize these 6 cards already, it's kind of something that was worth using. And the fact what you've got to remember is when you activate a card like Change of Heart or Mind Control, they're a very easy bait out, because as soon as you activate it, it means your opponent's either got to use their negate on the board to make sure you don't steal one of their monsters, or they're going to let you steal one of their monsters. We've then got the 1 reasoning. So obviously with the familiars, you've got a 1 and a 2. Your big vampires are 6, 8, 7 and 5, and then you've got a 3 and a 4. Now obviously the 4 is a little bit inconsequential because you shouldn't really be playing that once I get the 3rd Vampire Ghost. But you still have the ability to technically mill your deck to get you to one of your monsters and act as a special summon as well. Card Destruction, so if you do end up going first, activating Card Destruction to put monsters in your opponent's graveyard can be very, very helpful, because then that's how you can make sure your Void can resolve if you do get the ability to summon it. And that's again why the Horus monsters can be very helpful for you, because the Horus monsters will give you free tribute fodder that you may need. 1 Call by the Grave, and then 1 Monster Reborn, followed up by Foolish Burial. So Monster Reborn being able to steal one of your opponent's monsters, again, means you're taking control of one of your opponent's monsters and you can utilize it no matter what level it is. For the hand traps, you've gone with triple Nibiru and triple Imperm. You can change the Nibiru up if you want to and go for something a little bit more focused like a Ash Blossom. But the idea is, again, you don't really want to be putting fires in your graveyard that your opponent can steal in this current format. But on top of that as well, Nibiru can be very, very powerful to be able to give you a monster as well as breaking your opponent's board. And like I said, you kind of want to be taking this deck more to a fun, local, casual environment. You're not really going to want to be taking vampires to like a regional or a YCS. You can do, but please do not go there with the expectation that you're going to topple the meta, because unfortunately, they just aren't there yet. Moving on to the extra deck. So we'll talk about the main ones first, and then I'll go over all of the others. So you've got the one zombie vampire and the Dampierre vampire. So both of these share the same effect, that if you use a monster with a level that is owned by your opponent for the XYZ summon of this card, you can treat it as a level 8 or a level 6. The zombie vampire, more people should be more familiar with because it has been utilised in other decks outside of this. Neither player can target this card with card effects or special summon monsters except those special summon monsters from the graveyard. You can detach one material from this card. Each player sends the top 4 cards of their deck to the graveyard, and then if a monster was sent to the graveyard by this effect, you get to special summon one of them to your field. So it's quite easy to go into a zombie vampire, mill one of your opponent's cards, and then bring it to your build and go into a vampire Sheridan. The only downside when you're not using the Horus engine is the only way you can really do and get into your zombie vampire is steal one of your opponent's monsters, and then you need a level 8 on the board. And the only level 8s that we are currently utilising is the Void, so it can get a little bit tricky. And then even the annoyingly Vampire Vamp is a 7. So the only other level 8 that we do play is Super Poly Target in the form of the Draco Necro. So it's very, very restrictive just to get one of your monsters on the board. But the idea is if you super poly your opponent's board and you can get a Void on there, you can overlay both if you want to. Again, this is what I'm saying, that if you wanted to make it as competitive as possible, you will unfortunately need to be looking at the Horus cards. But for now, you just need to utilise the idea that you're going to use one of your opponent's monsters as material for this card. And then the idea is you're going to mill your deck and your opponent's deck, steal one of their monsters, and then all you need to do is get another level 6 on the board, and that's how you can make your Vampire Sheridan with your zombie vampire. So Sheridan has the ability to detach a material from this card once per turn to target a card your opponent controls, send it to the graveyard. Once per turn, if a monster card or cards is sent from the field to your opponent's graveyard by a card effect, or a monster is destroyed by battle and sent to your opponent's graveyard, you get to detach a material from this card to special summon one of those monsters to your field in defense. So as Zombie Vampire can get into Sheridan, Sheridan can get into Zombie Vampire. Now, it would have been really nice if these had like a rank up ability where you could turn Sheridan into Vampire. Unfortunately, that isn't the case. Also, unfortunately, the other XYZ that we do play that is a vampire doesn't have the same ability as the Dampierre and the Zombie Vampire. So the one we are using is the Crimson Knight, and unfortunately this one, whereas these two are generic 8 and 6s, is specifically 2 level 5 zombie monsters, which is why you might want to consider playing something like Instant Fusion or Ready Fusion to make this more consistent. You get to detach a material from this card to target one monster your opponent controls, one monster in your opponent's graveyard, and special summon that target to your field. So again, it has the revival effect or the steal effect of these cards, but it doesn't have the ability to be using them as material. But you can only that monster can attack for the rest of this turn. You can only use the effect Crimson Vampire once per turn, and then once per turn during the standby phase of the next turn, after this card you controlled was destroyed by your opponent's card and sent to the graveyard, you get to special summon it in defense. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't attach any card to it as material, so it will just be there as an XYZ bit of fodder or additional tribute fodder, which is why it's quite nice. And that's the whole idea of Vampire Lord as well, is that they can constantly keep floating back, but you kind of want them to be, if this card is in the graveyard, rather than if it's in the graveyard and was destroyed, you kind of want it to be in the graveyard so they can constantly keep coming back as tribute fodder, because that's what the vampires need. We'll go over the last two XYZs. So we've got the Dragulus the Vampiric Dragon, technically a vampire, even though it's a worm, not a zombie. Go figure. So I actually really like this card because, again, I think the artwork is absolutely stunning. And again, you can see the red moon in the background. It kind of fits within the lore, which is really cool. So once per turn, during either player's turn, you get to detach an XYZ from this card, then target a face-up monster on the field that was specialed from the extra deck and change it to face-down defense. If this face-up card in its owner's control is sent to the graveyard or banished by your opponent's card effect, special summon this card in face-down defense. If this card is flipped face-up, you can send one card on the field to the graveyard. Again, really nice that it gets to float itself back. Bit of a disappointment that it needs to be sent via your opponent's card effects, but that's just the way it is. One Zeus, kind of had to break the rule of playing only zombies in this one, but this one can very easily be a second Sheridan, second Vampire, entirely up to you. And then, of course, for your super poly targets, like I said, we've got two of the Nether Souls. You can very easily play one Nether Soul, one Garura, one Mud Dragon. Really is up to you. And then for the Link monsters, this is where they get probably a little bit more important. So we are utilising two Vampire Sucker. Now, this one's obviously going to give your opponent a monster while also then being able to draw you a card, which is really nice. And if you would tribute a monster or monsters for a tribute summon, you get to tribute a zombie monster or monsters your opponent controls, even though you do not control them. So it's very nice to go into Vampire Sucker, bring the monster back to your opponent's board, and then use that as free tribute fodder. The only issue is, by the time you've got to this, you might have already used your original normal summon, and possibly even your extra normal summon. But if you haven't, keep that in mind. That's why your Vampire Domain is so important. We've then got the one Avendred Saviour, probably balanced between a vampire and a zombie, maybe. So this is just your aggressive Link 2, and the reason it's so aggressive is it becomes Revendred Slayer while it's face up on the field, and you can only use each of the following effects once per turn. Target a Vendred card in your graveyard, add it to your hand. Not going to happen. But during damage calculation, if this card battles an opponent's monster, quick effect, you send a zombie monster from your deck to the graveyard. That opponent's monster loses attack equal to the level of that monster that's sent to the graveyard times 200. So you can make it lose 1600 if you send Void, and then you've got the graveyard Void effect. You've also got all of the other options as well. We then got Dark the Dark Charmer. The reason this is so good is because it is one of the only Link monsters that lets you steal one of your opponent's monsters from the graveyard. So it lets you actually get control of one of your opponent's monsters, which means you can now go into Vampire Zombie, Zombie Vampire, and Sheridan. Very easy. And then Underworld Goddess, and then the final card that I said I'll talk about is the Vampire Fascinator. Now we do have Zombie Link 4s, but we don't have a Vampire Link 4, which is annoyingly exactly what Fascinator kind of locks you into. So this one requires 2 monsters, including a zombie monster. If it is Link summoned, you get to target a monster in your opponent's graveyard and special summon it to your field in defense. Also, you cannot special summon monsters for the rest of the turn except zombies. You get to tribute a vampire monster, then target one monster your opponent controls, take control of it until the end phase. Now, what would have been really, really kind of cool is the idea you could go Dark. Dark would bring back one monster from your opponent's graveyard, but you would need a vampire in order to, or a zombie technically, in order to go into Fascinator, which is why Zombie World can come into play quite nicely. You could then go into Fascinator. Fascinator then gives you the ability to steal one of them again, and annoyingly, because it tributes a vampire and not a zombie, the monster that you then steal from your opponent's graveyard can't be tributed to steal one from their field, which would have been really, really nice to be able to go, okay, cool, I'm going to bring back your monster, and then I'm going to bring back your monster with Dark the Dark Charmer, and then going to link off and go into Vampire Fascinator. I'm going to bring back that exact same monster again, and then tribute it off to take control of that monster on your field. And then if it had a zombie link, go, okay, cool, link those two into the go into the Link 4. And they kind of wanted a Link 4 that was a zombie, technically like a vampire, that would, like an access code that would do everything you needed to. But that's just wishful thinking and custom card making. Anyway, that is pretty much it for the zombie profile. Like I said, if you wanted to make this more competitive, if you wanted to make it more aggressive, the Horus engine, in my opinion, is the more aggressive route to go. And what you'd be looking for on the back of that is pretty much a demo list like this. So you would have 2 Horus monsters that can just be sent and then summoned. And then you'd be using your Imsetis, that's the expensive ones, and then your King Sarks. Now, the difference with using the Horus engine in this version compared to something like a zombie version is you can't really do a budget version of this, because you really do need Imseti to get you to the King Sark, to give you that draw so you don't lose all of your hand advantage, and then start putting your level 8s to the board to bring them back as your aggressors. If you are on a tighter budget, but you still want to be able to get into the zombie vampire as quickly and as consistently as possible, the next option you can consider is the Punk engine, which you'd be looking at like 3E Telly, possibly more Z Armins or Foxy Tunes if you wanted to. But again, trying to keep this as a minimum, you'd be looking at 6 engines. You would, 6 cards, and then you'd also consider your Ghost Ogre, because Ghost Ogre can act as a free extender. The benefit you'd get off the back of that is it then gives you some options to play some synchro monsters. Hello, Mr. Psychic and Punisher. But you take away from it being a vampire deck and you turn it into, how can I turbo out the zombie vampire as quickly as I possibly can, and then make Psychic and Punisher. So that's another option. Other cards that I would also consider, depending on what you're trying to, or how you want to play it, is you've got the option of Pot of Desires. This is just a really kind of cool draw card for the deck, because you discard quite a lot and you play a lot of cards at multiples apart from your big boss monsters, and it's rather one of those times when once you get one of those boss monsters into rotation, you don't mind playing the risk of banishing. Now, this will be more effective if you're using the Horus cards, because the Horus cards will allow you to get your cards to the graveyard first, deck thin your deck out, make sure you've got your zombie vampire, mill even more, and then you're just going to be desiring for more extension and more plays. I already talked about Ready Fusion and technically Instant Fusion that can just get you another level 5 zombie to give you more access to your Crimson Knight if you want to go down that route. Small World could be a good option, but again, that will come down to if you're playing any additional engines, because what you can do is you can utilize some of your hand traps can go into your zombies and then go into your Horus monsters, which gives you a bit more consistency for Imseti. For the Zombie Link 4, you've got your YUGIOH Go. The idea is I just feel Fascinator is a bit more aggressive than the YUGIOH Go. Yes, this is 500 more attack, and yes, I could use this to bring one of my opponent's monsters back from the graveyard, but again, this one specifically requires 2 or more zombie monsters, not 2 or more monsters including a zombie, so unless I've got Zombie World face up, no matter what I bring back from your opponent's graveyard, I can't get into it. So Other cards, of course, was Cycling and Punisher. And because you play a lot of normal spells, you can also play Triple Tactics Frost as well. And that can then mean that you can cut down the reliance on playing. Like, you play one talents if you wanted to. You have access to get to Reasoning, Card Destruction, Foolish Burial, Change of Heart, Marsh Change. Not Marsh Change. Mind Control. Though you could very easily play Marsh Change instead, which would be quite funny to turn one of your vampires into a Dark Lord. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the profile. Like I said, my initial process was to go into the Horus build of the deck. And I was like, at the end of the day, I can't imagine anyone's going to be like, oh, I really want to play I really want to play vampires, but I'm going to go out and spend £150 to do so. I think when you're going to be playing vampires, you're going to be like, I've got vampires running around. I like the idea of them. I like what vampires do. I know they're not massively competitive. I'm willing to pay 50 quid on them just to have a fun deck to play around with. And I felt that this would probably be more applicable to more of you out there than here, chuck £150 to make a £50 deck playable, or competitively, not even competitively viable. I think even if you put the Horus cards in there, you might end up just being Horus Beatdown. And if you're going to do that, you might as well just play Horus Stun, which is blah. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it's given you like a bit of an update to vampires themselves. Unfortunately, until Konami give this deck even more support, it needs more than just the Vampire Ghost. And it needs to be vampire themed and not zombie themed, just to kind of maintain what this deck wants to do. I understand that zombies are probably a little bit easier to provide support for, but you don't want these to go neglected because I still think they're really kind of cool. Artwork, absolutely amazing. Card effects are half decent. They just need something to tie it all together and make it relative. I'm not saying that I need this deck to go to a tier 0 vampire deck, but I would like to be able to go, oh, vampires could be rogue, or vampires could compete. Vampires have access to a card like Vampire Domain, which I know they already have their own field spell, but they kind of want something that gets to it quicker, gets to it easier, and just a card that turns them into, like, gives you the ability to steal one of your opponent's monsters more consistently and just easier searchable. So, and I think the XYZs are like a great example of that. Like, the fact that they can be made using one of your opponent's monsters, no matter what level it is, as long as it has one, is really kind of cool. And I would have liked them to have got link monsters exactly like that as well. Anyway, enough sidetracking. Hope you've enjoyed this. If you do have any questions at all, by all means, please put in the comments down below. I'll be more than happy to answer them. For now, as absolutely always, stay safe and, of course, happy dueling.